Shabbat Shalom to everyone. It's always a privilege to speak to you on a Friday night. I'm sure many of you are aware and even have a memory of an extraordinary political and religious figure in our country was named Father Robert Drinan. And Reverend Drinan was a Jesuit priest who served Congress for 10 years. He was elected in 1970 as a Democrat, and Father Drinan considered politics a natural extension of his work in public affairs and human rights. His bid for office came a year after he returned from a trip to Vietnam, where he said he had discovered that a number of political prisoners being held in South Vietnam was rapidly increasing, contrary to what the United States State Department had said. And in a book the next year, he urged Catholic Church to condemn the war as morally objectionable. Father Drinan ran for Congress on a platform of opposing the Vietnam War. During his congressional tenure, he normally wore a dark suit with a clerical collar, and he lived in a very simple room in the Jesuit community at Georgetown University. He opposed the draft, worked to abolish mandatory retirement, and his views on abortion and birth control were contrary to his church. And he became the first member of Congress to call for the impeachment of President Richard Nixon, although it was not related to the Watergate scandal, but to what Father Drinan viewed as the administration's undeclared war against Cambodia. And Father Drinan asked, can we be silent about the flagrant violation of the American Constitution? Can we impeach a president for concealing a burglary, but not for concealing a massive bombing? Father Drinan left office in 1980. After retirement, he served as a president of the Americans for Democratic Action, crisscrossing the country speaking about hunger and civil liberties and the perils of the arms race. He also spoke against President Ronald Reagan and President Bush, and lectured and wrote about gun control, world hunger, and the war on terrorism's impact on human rights. He taught at Georgetown University Law School. But why didn't he run for another term? Why did he leave Congress in 1980? Many of Father Drinan's most vehement detractors were Catholics who opposed him politically because they saw his electoral career distracting from his priestly calling. And this is really interesting. When I started investigating this, it said in 1970, Boston Globe poll found that 30% of voters in the 3rd District thought it inappropriate for a priest to run for office. The figure among Catholic voters was even higher. This was one reason Father Drinan had to run close races in his 2 campaigns. He was a Democrat, and a very liberal Democrat in a very liberal district. Didn't matter. Now this is where it really gets interesting. In 1980, Pope John Paul II ordered Father Drinan either to forgo re-election or leave the priesthood. Father Drinan had savored holding office, but there was no doubt in his mind that he was going to resign. Being a priest was more important to him than being a congressman. Vatican sources pointed out at the time that Article 139 of the Church Canon Law, I'm sure everyone studies canon law on a daily basis, but trust me, it's Article 139. If you want to check it out and report back to me if I'm telling you the truth or not. So Article 139 of the Church Canon Law forbids priests to hold elective office, though the provision does allow for local authorities to make exceptions if it's in the best interest of the community. But the Pope formally revoked only the exemption given to Drinan in 1970. Nonetheless, the church hierarchy interpreted the Pope's act as a signal that Pope John would apply Article 139 much more strictly than his predecessors did. In other words, He didn't want priests involved in politics. Some of Drynen's supporters in Massachusetts believe that the Pope ruled against the priests primarily because of his support of federal funding for abortion for the poor. Drynen did not personally favor abortion, but he argued that because the operation at the time was legal in the United States, it would be unjust for the government to deny abortion to women who cannot afford to pay for it. And Vatican sources emphatically denied any such motivation. They affirmed that the Pope's decision stemmed purely from the notion of separation from church and state. And one of the things that was alluded to, that when Pope John Paul II was in Poland as the most important, the bishop and the cardinal in Poland, one of the ways that he was able to have influence was he kept strictly apart from political issues. Okay. Why am I dragging up all this old history? Even any chance I have to talk about Pope John II, I take advantage of it because I think he's an incredible figure, even though he was, and a lot of things that he believed in I didn't agree with. Now, why drag up old history? This week's senatorial election makes the Drynen story very relevant to me. I am happy that Senator Raphael Warnock won re-election. He is a remarkably brilliant man. His acceptance speech was brilliant. And he is a remarkable orator. And he was here, and I met him because he was the guest speaker at several years ago at the Martin Luther King Jr. Interfaith event. And he's just a really lovely gentleman, a very humble man when you meet him. He has very incredible skills. The flavor of his message, however, was more sermon than speech. And I believe that religion should guide us in our political views. That was Martin Luther King, that is Pat Robertson. But what do you make of Warnock's language? So, of course, I found his speech and I started studying it. You see aren't you proud of me, all the orange? Okay. I started reading his speech in a language that he was using, and I wasn't comfortable. A couple of the phrases that made me nervous. 2 minutes, 5 seconds. It's all timed. And to God be the glory for the great things that God has done. Now, I think about that. Do we want to believe that God elected him? That it was God's providence that led to his re-election? I know people aren't going to like this, but I'm going to keep going. So it goes, I like giving messages that people aren't going to like. Okay, at least you'll talk about it. Okay, so then he has, this is cute. I like this, I want to thank my mother and father. I want to thank my siblings who are here. I'm one of 12 in my family. Clearly, my folks read the Bible. Be fruitful and multiply. That's good. That's good. Okay, I would have written that. This is... 10 minutes, 52 seconds. Let me read the whole thing. Let us not forget that when we entered, and I was loving this as I was listening to it. Tell me, I was loving it until I started thinking about it. Let us not forget that when we entered this runoff, a vestige of the ugly side of our complicated American story, state officials said that we couldn't vote on Saturday, but we sued them and we won. And the people once again rose up in a multiracial, multi-religious coalition of conscience. Now, you endured the rain, you endured the long lines, and you voted. And you did it because you believe, as I do, that democracy is the political enactment of a spiritual idea. The notion that each of us has within us a spark of divine that we were created imago Dei in the image of God. And this line really irritates me. And if you're not given to that kind of religious language, that's fine. Our tent is big. Okay, so you're going to tolerate people who aren't in your tent? I mean, you're going to tolerate the non-theist? Okay, where our God is, our tent is really great. And if you're not part of it, we'll tolerate you. What if this was a religious conservative? Would we like that? Okay, let me keep going. I'm sure you're liking this, aren't you?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you're really, I can feel it.
I know, can you feel it?
I can feel it. Okay, let me keep going here. This is the clincher. 18 minutes and 18 seconds. And he said, and here we are. And I want to thank the amazing people of Ebenezer Baptist Church who, amidst the attack, stuck with your pastor. Thank you, Ebenezer Church. Now, here I gave you his lines, and certainly they weren't meant to be religiously heavy-handed. But the reality is that this speech is not just fancy political rhetoric. He is a leader of one of the most powerful black churches in America where Martin Luther King Jr. served. Have anyone been to the church? Go to the church in Atlanta and then go to the home of where Martin Luther King Jr. Grew up. It's a national, like it's under the, who runs the heritage things? Park Service. You got to go into this place where you see where Martin Luther King used to eat dinner, and and we were told that his father would quiz Martin Luther King about verses from the Bible. You got to see this. So, Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock, is a leader of the most powerful black church in America. Reverend Warnock, Senator Warnock, we're not sure what he is, has been senior pastor at the Baptist Church since 2005, and committed to maintaining the post from the earliest days of his 2020 special campaign. He's not on leave. He preaches from the pulpit every week, or mostly every week. I don't know how he finds the time to write the sermons, but somehow he does. Though he embraces politics from the pulpit and makes frequent mentions of his home church on the trail, his Senate and campaign aides say that his function as a pastor operates entirely separately from his political roles. Now, is that possible? He walks out of the church on a Sunday, and that's what he did, and goes directly to a political rally. Now, Mr. Warnock has described himself as a Christian progressive in the mold of Dr. King. Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist, not a senator. Senator Warnock is a full-time minister. He preaches from the pulpit. He's a brilliant theologian. He has a PhD from Union Theological Seminary in systematic theology. That's wonderful. But let's be honest with ourselves. Do we give him a pass because many of us like his politics? Consider where we are in America today. And the threat of Christian nationalism and the blurring of religion and politics is increasing. Do we want religious rhetoric in our politics? A person should, of course, not be prevented from proclaiming his faith. I'm happy that President Biden is a religious man who goes to church. President Biden isn't a priest. The White House isn't his parsonage. President Bush was a devout Christian, and he said something in terms of his own personal issues. He said, Jesus changed my heart. But he was not a minister. He was a person of faith. There's a difference. The model of senator and minister does not feel right to me at this moment in American history. I believe that there is more wisdom in the views of Pope John Paul II than we might be willing to admit. And I ask you to reflect upon this as we work to repair the rifts and uncertainties that challenge our nation. Think about that this Shabbat.